Hi, I finally got back to watching Frieren, and I'm sorry that you had to wait for such a long time for my reviews to resume, but the good news is that both episode 7 and episode 8 were fantastic, and I am very excited to talk about it. I know that I praised this show a lot even after the first 6 episodes, but I feel like these last 2 episodes cemented a few specific things for me. First, this story takes familiar tropes and does them actually well by either subverting them or by exploring them in a unique way. Secondly, the structure of this story is masterful because even the tiniest moment can end up tying into the greater story. And lastly, I don't know who's responsible for the framing, if it's taken directly from the manga panels or are these original show decisions, but can I borrow 5% of your brain for my own projects? Thank you. But on a more serious note, I want to start this discussion by expanding on these points and giving some examples from episodes 7 and 8. So the first one is about tropes. As I watched episode 7, I wrote down this question: are there any good demons? And then I crossed it out the second Frieren began telling that story about a demon child and how demons use speech to deceive humans. I feel like most stories usually choose complexity and say that not every monster is bad, and that's great, don't get me wrong, but I feel like there's this belief that a complex idea is automatically better than a simple one, and I disagree. I believe that the only thing that matters is execution. So if we look at Frieren, they took the oldest tale possible, one of good versus evil, one about a party of heroes traveling and fighting monsters, and yet those classic ideas are explored in such an interesting way. On the demons side, we explored the idea of using human speech and appealing to human empathy to deceive them. I also think that the similarities between someone like Lugna and some real-world politicians were probably not accidental. On the heroes' side, our guys also aren't exactly traditional heroes. For example, let's look at Stark. By the way, on a side note, I've been informed that his name is supposed to be pronounced as Stark and not Stark because this is an actual German word. I knew that all names in Frieren sounded German, but apparently not only do they sound German, but they actually are just German words. I'm struggling with German pronunciation even more than English, probably because I don't even speak German, but I'll try to do my best. Another side note is a quite funny story how I came to this conclusion about the names in the first place, other than the comments under my videos, of course. When I heard Lugna's name, I knew that it means liar, and the reason why I knew that, and it's a very random reference, but it was actually from Heathers the musical and the Ich lüge bullets from that musical. I know, very random reference, but I think it's just fun making connections between the most random things and how you can learn something and then apply it in a completely different context. By the way, put a pin in that because I will bring this idea back when I talk about Frieren and her powers later in this video. But with these side notes out of the way, let's go back to Stark. The trope of being scared and still choosing to fight isn't a new one, but I feel like most stories turn it into a one-time thing or use it selectively. What I adore about Frieren is how it wasn't a one-time thing for Stark. He didn't defeat the dragon and suddenly stop trembling because now he knows he's strong. No. Being a coward is an inseparable part of his character design, just like it was with Aizen's. And I love how the show portrays this daily and never-ending fight against yourself, basically. It's like Frieren took this classic fantasy trope and then made it mundane. Another example is exploring humanity. That's another very common trope in fantasy stories, but what usually happens is that you have a group of beings with powers, and then the humanity is explored through the only human character with no special abilities. Frieren reversed that because we explore what it means to be human through the eyes of an ancient elf who was established from the very beginning to struggle with understanding people, and I find this concept so fascinating. But my favorite example of playing with tropes was actually in episode 8 with Graf Granat. He is smart. He immediately understood that Frieren wouldn't kill a guard and that Lugna is lying. I was so happy to see that because my first thought when Drat killed that guard in episode 7 was, oh great, Frieren is going to get blamed for that. I despise the misunderstanding trope, so every time any story makes a twist like this, it makes me beyond happy. A similar thing applies to Fern and Stark believing Frieren's words about demons. I feel like many stories would do a plotline where these two would argue that, hey, maybe things have changed, maybe demons genuinely want peace, and they wouldn't learn until experiencing something horrific for themselves. But no, they just believed Frieren and that's it. I know that some of these examples may sound like very small things, but I still can't help but geek out over Frieren's approach to telling a very familiar and classic tale. But let's move on to my second point about structure. I'm only 8 episodes in, but it's already clear that every single scene and every single frame we see on screen is purposeful and is not only meaningful in the moment, but also ties into the greater story. In a way, the structure of Frieren really reminds me of the Apothecary Diaries, another fantastic show that I am watching and am fully caught up with. In both cases, we get these episodic adventures and somehow the smallest details end up coming back and tie into the larger conflicts or greater themes. So to give some examples from Frieren's episodes 7 and 8, we can look at the whole speech conflict. In earlier episodes, we were told that Aizen never praised Stark, and yet we saw how they both clearly love each other and care about each other because human connections go way deeper than just the words. And now, this new arc reinforces the same theme by showing the opposite scenario, where demons keep saying all the right words, but speech is simply not enough. In Frieren's own words, demons are wild beasts who imitate human speech but can't be communicated with. Both examples individually would have still worked perfectly, but there's just something extra special that they can also be tied together. Another example is how Flamme's first introduction ties into the current arc. What was the very first shot that we saw of her? It was Flamme putting a protective barrier around a tree sapling. And now we found out that this specific spell is actually the barrier spell that was first introduced in episode 6, if I'm not mistaken, and is now coming back as a major plot point. But more on Flamme and that spell later. Another example is Fern and Stark's plan at the end of episode 8. It was identical to the plan with the dragon, where Stark is supposed to create an opening for the mage to deal the finishing blow. The beautiful thing is how last time this plan was a deception, and yet it didn't stop Stark from attempting it again and trusting that this time Fern wouldn't leave him. On top of that, Fern's first introduction established how she can basically turn invisible with how well she controls her mana, so when in episode 8 we saw that in action, we didn't have to break the pacing to explain this aspect. Once again, I know that these are very small things, but I think that these things make the writing of Frieren feel very neat and satisfying, and it also promises to the audience that trying to keep track of smaller details and smaller themes will be rewarded. The final thing that I highlighted was the framing. I mostly talked about the shot framing, but I meant that it applies to the framing in general as well. For example, let's look at the very first scene in episode 7. Frieren said, "I'm probably the only one who remembers her face," as the shot focused on Himmel but didn't show his face. I adored that composition. Just like Flamme, one day Himmel will also inevitably turn into a legend. His statues will crumble, his portraits, if there are any, will fade, and Frieren will be the only one to remember his face. And even if we ignore the image, there's still a difference between remembering a historical figure and remembering the real person behind that figure. People only see Himmel, the hero, but Frieren sees just this guy with his own flaws. Obviously, that's a more philosophical reading of that shot. There's also a more direct meaning that as Frieren said those words, Himmel noticed that it made her sad and tried to prevent her feeling the same way about their group by making sure that their group was immortalized in statues and wouldn't turn into fairy tales. But to me, what was more interesting was specifically the decision to not show Himmel's face, as Frieren talked about being the only one to remember Flamme's face. Another framing-related thing was how Frieren continues the trend of creating parallel shots. There were many examples in the first 6 episodes, and it continues to be true now, so I'll just put some examples on screen. But now, let's move on to some other extremely interesting details from episodes 7 and 8. Technically, I could have fit some of them into my earlier points, but I don't want to stretch some things just to fit them into a specific structure, if that makes any sense. The first thing that I want to address is the fact that apparently elves have little interest in reproducing and romance in general and are slowly going extinct. While the extinction part is obviously sad, but addressing a point like that in the first place is very cool. First of all, in my notebook I wrote down that Frieren is an ace icon, and I don't care that she's an elf and not even a human, but she's still an ace icon. But this is also very cool on a mechanical world building level. I actually considered talking about this in the section about the tropes. There are so many stories, especially the modern romantasy, where you have beings that live for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and then they have families with like 7 children. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but also not really. And yet those fictional worlds don't address the overpopulation problem that they would undoubtedly have when kids keep being born, but no one dies since they don't really age. So it's such a relief to see a modern fantasy story where this is actually addressed. On a more symbolic level, I also love how Frieren portrays that creating a family and having kids isn't the only goal that exists in life. It's perfectly fine to not want those things at all and have a fulfilling life by focusing on things that actually interest you, just like Frieren is currently doing. And while I'm still on the topic of Frieren, we got a glimpse into her past with a burning house and a lonely set of swings. Given the timing of that flashback, it's probably a memory of losing her family or at least someone close to her. And while I know that it will almost surely be extremely sad when we get to that part, but I couldn't help but laugh because I got war flashbacks to the swings from Naruto. If you've seen that show, then I am sure you won't judge me and sympathize with my struggle. But moving on, I'm also interested in Frieren's powers, and more specifically, is she really a natural genius as Lugna seems to think, or did she train really hard to get where she is now? On the surface level, she just seems genuinely overpowered, but the reason why I think it might be more complicated than just the talent is how she approaches magic. First, she collects all kinds of ridiculous spells, but just because something sounds ridiculous, it doesn't mean that it can't be useful. Episode 8 established how, apparently, Frieren modified Zoltrak to be specifically a demon-killing spell. But to make those modifications, you need a lot of knowledge and creativity, and collecting all kinds of spells indicates that Frieren has those. So I feel like Lugna might be wrong, and the reason why Frieren got to the level where she is today is due to her own effort and endless curiosity. On a partially related note, I want to talk about Flamme's barrier spell. Just stick with me and hopefully my point will start making more sense. What stood out to me a lot is that when Flamme put it around the plant, it looked like a soft blanket, and yet it's extremely powerful and protects whole towns from demons. I feel like this was a hint to Frieren's approach to magic. My question is, what was the main purpose of those scenes where Flamme put the barrier around the plants? Was it to show that she can casually use even something as powerful as this barrier spell? Or perhaps it was the opposite, and the idea to protect plants came before expanding that spell to protect whole towns from demons. If the second option is true, then it would explain Frieren's skills. She collects the most ridiculous spells because, just like the plant barrier, they can be used in crafting more powerful spells. Obviously, that's just my current theory. It doesn't have to be the case, but I just think it would be pretty cool. On a more symbolic level, I love how the demon's approach to magic research is fundamentally different from Frieren and Flamme, and also naturally inferior due to that isolated nature. People are not like robots who only have a limited set of rules they can follow. Humans don't live in isolation. We always learn and grow and apply the knowledge we gathered in all areas of life. We can even look at this video that I'm currently recording. I recognized that Lugna means liar not because I speak German, but because I watched Heathers the musical. And that's a very funny and small-scale example. If we look at bigger and more important things, then the best inventions are born when people think outside the box. So going back to Frieren, I feel like my theory makes sense. Flamme thought outside the box, combined different knowledge and turned a spell that protected plants to a very powerful barrier. Frieren learned that creative approach to magic and she now collects any and all spells and can apply that knowledge to modifying the big spells. Once again, like I said, this is just a theory and I might be overthinking things, but I find this concept very interesting and exciting. Next, let's move on to Aura. She's one of the 7 sages of destruction who were first mentioned in episode 6. In that conversation, they also mentioned this hero of the south and how he was defeated by those sages. I'm still holding on to my theory that he either didn't die, or if he did die, then we will meet someone related to him on our journey. But for now, let's go back to Aura. It's so interesting that she regained her power 28 years ago, which is the exact same time when Himmel died. Coincidence? I don't think so. So was Aura that scared of Himmel, even if he was an old man, that she didn't dare act before that? Or was there something specific that Himmel did that disappeared once he died? After his funeral, we saw Frieren holding a ring that I assumed was Himmel's, so my current best guess is that maybe that ring is somehow special and kept demons like Aura at bay. The last point about Aura is that I noticed she was holding scales, so that's probably related to her powers. I have no specific theories on that, but it looks like it might be something more complex compared to what we've seen so far. Another character I want to briefly go back to is Shtak. I loved how almost angry he seemed when at the end of episode 8, Lugna wasn't looking at him, just like during their first meeting. I feel like pride can be such a good motivator. As far as I know, English only has one word for pride and it describes both pride as in the sin and also the positive meaning of pride. But some other languages use different words for those two types of pride, so I want to emphasize that when I talk about pride here, I mean specifically the positive definition of that. Shtak was scared and trembling and he probably would rather not fight, but being not seen as an opponent even worth acknowledging, that wounded his pride and became a motivator to fight despite the fear. Pride is a very interesting but also tricky thing to explore in fiction. There are many characters who lose due to their pride and also many characters who win thanks to it, and I feel like the main difference is whether that pride is external or internal. What I mean by that is, are you proud by thinking that the others are worse than you, or are you proud by wanting to be the best version of yourself without underestimating the others? In Shtak's case, this is clearly the second option, so in his case, his pride is a good thing. Or at least that's my personal interpretation of pride. I have just a few more notes. First, the action was fantastic. As much as I love the storytelling and the themes of Frieren, but I also absolutely appreciate those purely hype moments and action. Secondly, I continue adoring the character dynamics, especially between Fern and Shtak. And the last note I have is on Drat's final words. Wait, let's talk this before getting crushed. It was a small but such a great cherry on top. Empty words is the only thing that these demons have to defend themselves when violence and magic aren't enough anymore. And that's all I have. I'm so excited to continue this arc, which is the first longer arc compared to the episodic format that we had so far. I love the idea of splitting up the group so that Frieren can deal with Aura while Fern and Stark deal with Aura's executioners. It sets up two equally interesting battles, and not every story accomplishes that. Usually there's one scene that you want to see more than the other, so I'm a bit surprised myself that I'm equally invested in both storylines here. But for now, thank you for your time. Please share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe if you're interested, and I hope to see you again for the discussions of future episodes.